I want you to picture a crime scene, but not a normal one. This is a crime scene where the victim is civilization itself. Imagine walking into a modern house where the water is still running, the heated floors are still warm, and there's a library full of books. But the people are gone, and the people who moved in afterwards, they don't know how to turn off the water. They don't know how to read the books. They tear up the floorboards to burn them for heat. For 1,000 years, humanity forgot how to build a dome. We forgot how to make concrete. We essentially gave ourselves a global lobotomy. How does that happen? How does the most advanced superpower on Earth just delete itself? The answer isn't what you think. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a sudden invasion. It was a suicide. And the weapon they used, you're not going to believe it. Welcome to the disaster movie that is the early Middle Ages. But before we get to the knights in the castles, we have to talk about the catastrophe that started it all, the fall of Rome. Now, textbooks will tell you that Rome fell in 476 AD. It's a convenient date for a multiple minus choice test. But empires don't just trip and fall over on a Tuesday afternoon. They rot. And Rome had been rotting for a long time. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire wasn't the glorious superpower of Julius Caesar or Marcus Aurelius. It was a bloated, corrupt, bureaucratic mess. If you lived in Rome in 400 AD, your life was a nightmare of inflation and taxation. The currency had been debased so many times that the silver coins were basically copper, washed in silver paint. Prices were skyrocketing. The middle class was being wiped out. The rich, the senatorial class, were dodging taxes with an efficiency that modern billionaires would envy, retreating to their massive fortified villas in the countryside and letting the state crumble. And being the emperor, that was statistically the most dangerous job in the world. Seriously, the turnover rate was insane. If you weren't assassinated by your own Praetorian Guard within 2 years, you were practically a legend. The government was paralyzed. But the fatal blow, the thing that actually killed the beast, didn't come from inside. It came from a refugee crisis that Rome completely mishandled. And this is where the story gets human. This is where we stop looking at maps and start looking at people. We call them the barbarians, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks. The Romans used that word, barbarian, to describe anyone who didn't shave, wore trousers instead of gas, and drank beer instead of wine. The Romans looked down on them with a sneering imperial arrogance. But these weren't monsters. They were neighbors. They had been trading with Rome for centuries. Many of them served in the Roman army. They admired Rome. They wanted the Roman life. They wanted the heated floors and the wine and the stability. And in the late 4th century, they were terrified. They were running from something that even the Romans didn't understand. If you need a villain for the first act of this story, it is the Huns. We don't know exactly why they started moving west. Maybe climate change dried up the grass on the Asian steppes, but when they moved, the world shook. The Huns were the ultimate nightmare fuel. They lived in their saddles. They practiced cranial deformation, binding the heads of their infants so their skulls grew into elongated, alien shapes to terrify their enemies. They fired composite bows with deadly precision from hundreds of yards away. When the Huns attacked the Germanic tribes in Eastern Europe, panic spread like a virus. Imagine a line of dominoes. The Huns hit the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogoths ran west and hit the Visigoths. The Visigoths ran west and hit the Roman border at the Danube River. In 376 AD, a massive crowd of Gothic refugees, men, women, children, wagons, livestock appeared on the banks of the Danube. They sent messengers to the Roman Emperor Valens, begging for asylum. "Let us in," they said. "The devils are behind us." Now, this was a pivotal moment in human history. Rome had a choice. They could have let the Goths in, fed them, settled them on empty farmland, and recruited them into the army. It would have revitalized the empire. But Rome chose the path of exploitation. The Roman governors on the border, Lupicinus and Maximus, saw these desperate people not as human beings, but as a profit margin. They allowed the Goths to cross the river, but they stripped them of their weapons or tried to and then refused to feed them. The historical records from this time are stomach-minus churning. The Roman commanders created a black market for food. They charged exorbitant prices for bread. When the Goths ran out of money, the Romans made a sickening offer. They would trade dog meat for Gothic children. One dog for one child. Think about the level of desperation required for a father to hand over his son into slavery just to get a carcass of a stray dog to feed the rest of his family. That level of cruelty does not go unpunished. Rage is a powerful fuel. The Goths realized that the civilized Romans were the real monsters. They realized that the Roman legions were actually thin on the ground. So they revolted. They broke out of the containment camps. They didn't have the best armor, and they were starving, but they had fury. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, the Goths did the unthinkable. They caught the Roman field army in the open. The Roman Emperor Valens, arrogant to the end, refused to wait for reinforcements. He attacked, and the Goths annihilated them. They killed -3 of the Roman army. They killed the emperor himself. His body was never found. He likely burned to death in a cottage where he tried to hide. Adrianople was the moment the mask slipped. The world realized that the Roman giant had feet of clay. The psychological impact was devastating. Street, Jerome, writing from his cell in Bethlehem, wrote, "The whole world has perished in one city." From that moment on, the borders were just lines on a map. It was open season on the empire. The Goths marched through the Balkans. Later, the Vandals, who really lived up to their name, toured Europe, smashing things until they crossed into Spain and then into North Africa. This was a strategic checkmate. North Africa was the breadbasket of Rome. It was where the grain was grown to feed the massive population of Italy. When the Vandals took Carthage, they turned off the food tap. Rome began to starve. The city, which once held 1 million people, shrank to a few thousand. Wolves started roaming the forum. The great libraries were abandoned. Finally, in 476 AD, the end arrived, but it didn't come with a bang. It came with a pathetic whimper. The last Western emperor was a boy named Romulus Augustulus. Augustulus means Little Augustus. Even his name was a joke. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer, who was technically a general in the Roman army because by this point, the Roman army was almost entirely German mercenaries, decided he was tired of the charade. He walked into the palace in Ravenna, stripped the boy of his purple robes, and sent him into retirement at a villa in the south. Odoacer didn't even bother to declare himself emperor. He knew the title was worthless. He simply packed up the imperial crown and the royal insignia and shipped them to Constantinople, to the Eastern emperor. He sent a note that effectively said, "We don't need an emperor in the West anymore. I'll take it from here." And just like that, the sun set on the Roman Empire. Now, pause for a second. Think about the reality of that. We say the Dark Ages, and historians hate that term because it sounds judgmental. They say, "Oh, there was still art. There was still culture." Sure, but from an economic and material standpoint, it was pitch black. The infrastructure collapsed. The aqueducts, those marvels of engineering that brought fresh water from 50 miles away, began to leak, and nobody knew how to fix them. The specialized knowledge was gone. The water stopped flowing. People started drinking from the Tiber River, which was basically a sewer. Disease skyrocketed. The great stone roads, the arteries of the empire, were neglected. Grass grew through the cracks. Bridges collapsed. Travel became impossible. If you lived in Gaul in 300 AD, you could buy pottery made in North Africa and oil from Syria. By 500 AD, if it wasn't made in your village, you didn't have it. The world shrank. Your horizon went from the ends of the earth to the edge of the dark forests surrounding your farm. Literacy plummeted. Why learn to read when there are no jobs in administration? Why buy books when you need to buy a sword to protect your family from bandits? In this power vacuum, Europe became a gangster's paradise. The state was gone. There was no 911. There was no police. The only law was the law of the knife. Strong men took what they wanted, and weak men died. It was a time of warlords. And out of this chaos, one family rose to the top. They were the Franks. Living in the ruins of Roman Gaul, what we now call France, the Franks were not the most numerous tribe, nor the most civilized, but they were the most ruthless. And they had a leader who was a genius of violence. His name was Clovis. Clovis is the godfather of medieval Europe. He became king of his specific Frankish tribe at the age of 15. In our world, a 15-year-old is worrying about geometry homework. In the 5th century, a 15-year-old king had to kill or be killed. Clovis was a predator. He looked at the chaos of post-Roman Europe and saw a ladder. One by one, he crushed his rivals. And when I say rivals, I don't just mean enemy generals. I mean his own family. He had a favorite trick. He would find the son of a rival chieftain, whisper in his ear, "Hey, your father is getting old and weak. If you were to have an accident, I would support you as king." The son, greedy for power, would kill his father. Then Clovis would march in, act horrified, execute the son for the crime of patricide, and annex the kingdom for himself. It was brutal. It was Machiavellian. And it worked. But Clovis was smart enough to know that you can rule a kingdom the size of France just by cracking skulls. You need legitimacy. You need a brand. You need a story that explains why you are in charge. The people of Gaul were not Franks. They were Gallo-Romans. And most importantly, they were Catholic Christians. Clovis was a pagan. He worshipped the old Germanic gods of thunder and war. He realized that if he wanted to rule these people without fighting a rebellion every Tuesday, he needed to join their club. The turning point came in 496 AD. Clovis was fighting the Alemanni, another fierce Germanic tribe. The battle was going badly. His lines were breaking. His men were panicking. Clovis looked up at the sky. He knew Woden wasn't helping. He remembered his wife, Clotilde. She was a Christian princess who had been nagging him for years to convert. In desperation, Clovis made a bet. He shouted, "Christ, if you grant me this victory, I will believe in you and be baptized in your name." And then, a miracle or a coincidence happened. The king of the Alemanni was struck by a stray projectile and died. His army dissolved. Clovis won. And Clovis was a man who paid his debts. On Christmas Day, 496, in the city of Reims, Clovis walked into the baptistry. The bishop Remigius stood there in his golden robes. The air smelled of incense. Clovis stripped off his furs and his weapons. He stepped into the holy water. The bishop said, "Bow your head, proud sea Cambrian. Burn what you have adored, and adore what you have burned." This moment cannot be overstated. When the water touched Clovis's head, the history of Europe pivoted. Before this, the barbarian kings were enemies of the church. Now, they were partners. Clovis gave the church his sword. He would protect them. He would kill heretics. He would grant them land. In return, the church gave Clovis something money couldn't buy: divine right. The priests told the peasants to disobey the king is to disobey God. It was the perfect symbiotic relationship. The throne and the altar. This alliance would define European politics for the next 1,000 years. It legitimized the Frankish conquest. It allowed Clovis to unify the tribes into what we now call the Merovige in a dynasty. But don't let the baptism fool you. Clovis didn't stop being a gangster. He just became a Christian gangster. After his conversion, he continued to murder his relatives to secure his throne. When he died, he was the master of a massive kingdom, but he left behind a fatal flaw. The Franks didn't understand the concept of a state. They thought of the kingdom as the king's personal property, like a farm or a cow. So when a king died, he didn't leave the kingdom to his eldest son. He split it among all his sons. Imagine if the President of the United States died and left the East Coast to his oldest son, the Midwest to his middle son, and the West Coast to the youngest. And then, they all started fighting each other. That is exactly what happened to the Franks. For the next 200 years, the Merovige in a history is a soap opera of civil wars, assassinations, and incompetence. We call them the do-nothing kings. By the 8th century, these kings were long-haired puppets. They sat in ox-carts and waved at the crowds. But the real decisions were made by the mayor of the palace, basically the chief of staff. The king was the mascot. The mayor was the CEO. And the greatest of these mayors was a man named Charles. Charles had a problem. A massive problem. While the Europeans had been busy squabbling in the mud and burning down their own civilization, a new superpower had risen in the south. We have to look away from the forests of France and look to the deserts of Arabia. In the early 7th century, a merchant named Muhammad founded a new faith, Islam. The expansion of the Islamic Caliphate is one of the most breathtaking military feats in human history. In less than 100 years, the armies of Islam swept out of the Arabian Peninsula. They conquered the Persian Empire. They conquered the Byzantine provinces of Syria and Egypt. They swept across North Africa, converting the populations and establishing a civilization that was light years ahead of Europe in terms of science, medicine, and mathematics. By 711 AD, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and entered Spain. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain collapsed almost instantly. The Islamic cavalry, light and fast, was unstoppable. They pushed north, crossing the Pyrenees Mountains. They entered France. This was not a raid. This was a conquest. The governor of Islamic Spain, Abdul Rahman, led a massive army north, intent on taking the wealthy city of Tours and perhaps moving on to Paris. Stand in the shoes of Charles in the year 732 AD. He knows what is coming. He knows that the Islamic army is undefeated. He knows they have heavy cavalry and he has mostly foot soldiers. If he loses, the Franks are done. Europe likely becomes a province of the Caliphate. The Pope probably ends up in exile. The entire trajectory of Western history hangs by a thread. Charles was a brilliant strategist. He knew he couldn't beat the Arabs in a race or a maneuver battle. He had to force them to fight on his terms. He chose his ground carefully, a wooded hill between the cities of Poitiers and Tours. The trees would break up the charge of the enemy cavalry. He gathered his men of veterans who had spent years fighting on the frontiers. He told them one thing: stand. He formed a phalanx, a shield wall. For 7 days, the two armies stared at each other. The Muslims were waiting for Charles to come down onto the plain. Charles was waiting for them to come up. Finally, Abdul Rahman attacked. It was October. It was cold. The Islamic cavalry charged up the hill. Thousands of horses slammed into the Frankish line. The sound of steel on steel was deafening. But the line held. The chronicles describe the Franks standing immobile like a wall of ice. They didn't panic. They didn't break. They hacked at the horses' legs. They pulled riders from their saddles. Charles was in the thick of it, swinging his warhammer, smashing helmets, an anchor of morale for his men. The battle raged until nightfall. Both sides retreated to their camps. The Franks slept on their shields, exhausted, expecting another wave in the morning. But when the sun rose, silence, the scouts went forward. The Islamic tents were there, but they were empty. Abdul Rahman had been killed in the fighting. Leader listened, demoralized by the stubborn resistance of the Franks. The Islamic army had packed up in the night and retreated back to Spain. Charles had done the impossible. He had stopped the unstoppable force. After this battle, nobody called him just Charles anymore. They gave him a nickname, Martel, the Hammer. Charles the Hammer. This victory did two things. First, it secured the borders of Christendom. Second, it made the mayor of the palace the undisputed hero of the Franks. It set the stage for Charles's family, the Carolingi and Nestillo, eventually take the crown for themselves. And the man who would finally do that, the man who would take this Frankish kingdom and turn it into an empire, was Charles's grandson, a man named Charlemagne. But Charlemagne is a story that requires a deep dive of its own. He wasn't just a king, he was a phenomenon. He was a man who tried to single-handedly drag Europe out of the mud and back into the light. And to understand him, we have to understand the world. He was born into a world where the only way to create peace was to wage constant, brutal, unrelenting war. The hammer blow at Tours stopped the invasion, but it didn't fix the world. Europe was still a broken puzzle. It needed someone to put the pieces back together. Enter Charlemagne. Now, if you look at the official statues of Charlemagne, you see a saintly figure with a long beard, holding a scepter, looking very regal and holy. But let's be real. That is propaganda. The real Charlemagne was a force of nature. He was a giant. Literally, forensic analysis of his bones suggests he was around 6 feet 4 inches tall, which in the 8th century made him basically the Incredible Hulk. He had a thick neck, a punch, and a voice that was famously high-pitched and squeaky, which must have been terrifying when he was screaming orders on a battlefield. And he was always on a battlefield. He spent 40-6 years of his 40-7- year reign at war. He fought in the swamps of Saxony, the mountains of Spain, the plains of Hungary, and the hills of Italy. The man knew peace for exactly 1 year of his adult life. For the rest of it, he was in the saddle, swinging the sword called Joyous. His goal was simple but insane. He wanted to restore factory settings on Europe. He wanted to bring back Rome. He looked at the mess of squabbling tribes and petty kingdoms and said, "No, I want one empire, one god, one emperor." And he was ruthless about it. Take the Saxons, for example. The Saxons were a fierce pagan tribe living in what is now northern Germany. They worshipped trees and springs. They raided Frankish border towns. Charlemagne decided he was going to conquer them, not just for land, but for their souls. He spent 30 years fighting the Saxon Wars. It was a brutal, grinding insurgency, like Vietnam in the Middle Ages. The Saxons would surrender in the summer when Charlemagne's army was there, and then rebel in the winter as soon as he left. Charlemagne's patience eventually snapped. In 782, at the massacre of Verdun, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners in a single day. He had them beheaded on the banks of the Aller River because they refused to convert to Christianity. The river ran red. That is not the action of a saint. That is the action of a warlord who believes he is on a mission from God. His policy was simple: convert or die. But here is the fascinating contradiction of Charlemagne. This brutal, blood-soaked warrior was also a massive nerd. Charlemagne was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. He spoke a rough Germanic dialect, but he had a deep, almost desperate love for learning. He kept a wax tablet under his pillow so that if he woke up in the middle of the night, he could practice tracing his letters like a schoolchild. He realized that you can't run an empire if your governors can't read the laws and your priests can't read the Bible. So he launched a cultural revolution known as the Carolingian Renaissance. He imported the smartest men in Europe to his court in Aachen, men like Alcuin of York, an English monk who was basically the smartest guy in the room. Charlemagne told them copy everything. He turned monasteries into scriptry, a mess medieval copy shops. If you have ever read a book by Cicero, or Caesar, or Tacitus, you should thank Charlemagne. 90% of the ancient Roman literature that exists today survived because Charlemagne's monks copied it onto parchment before the original papiers, scrolls rotted away. He essentially backed up the hard drive of Western civilization while simultaneously chopping people's heads off. The climax of his life, and perhaps the most important moment of the early Middle Ages, happened on Christmas Day in the year 800. Charlemagne was in Rome. He was kneeling in Praran Street, Peter's Basilica. As he rose from his knees, Pope Leo I approached him from behind and placed a jeweled crown on his head. The congregation shouted, "To Charles, the Augustus, crowned by God, great and Pacific Emperor, life and victory." Boom! The Holy Roman Empire was born. Now, Charlemagne later claimed he was surprised. He said, "If I had known the Pope was going to do that, I never would have entered the church." Yeah, right? You don't accidentally organize a coronation. It was a calculated political theater. By crowning Charlemagne, the Pope was sending a message to the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople: you guys are irrelevant. The real power is here, in the West, with this big German guy. And for Charlemagne, it was the ultimate legitimacy. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was the successor to the Caesars. But there is a problem with empires built by geniuses. They are held together by the force of the genius's personality. When the genius dies, the gravity fails. Charlemagne died in 814. He left his empire to his son, Louis the Pious. Louis was a nice guy, very religious. But nice doesn't work in the Middle Ages. Louis's sons, Charlemagne's grandsons, were greedy, jealous, and incompetent. They spent decades fighting a civil war over their inheritance. Finally, in 843, they signed the Treaty of Verdun, which split the empire into 3 slices. The West became France, the East became Germany, the middle became a weird strip of land called Lothar in GIA that France and Germany would fight over for the next 1,000 years. Literally, World War I was partially about who owned that strip of land. So, by the mid-9th century, the Franks were distracted. They were fighting each other. Their armies were out of position. And that is exactly when the nightmare started. We have to look north, up to the freezing mists of Scandinavia. For centuries, the people up there, the Norse, had been farmers and fishermen. But something changed in the 8th century. Maybe it was overpopulation. Maybe it was a warming climate. Maybe it was just a cultural shift that glorified violence. Young men who had no land began to look overseas for opportunity. And they had a piece of technology that was light years ahead of anything else in Europe: the longship. We need to appreciate the engineering brilliance of the Viking longship. It was clinker-minus built, meaning the planks overlapped, which made it flexible in rough seas. But the real genius was the draft. It only needed about 3 feet of water to float. This meant a longship could cross the stormy North Sea, but it could also sail up a shallow river. It could land on a beach. It was the medieval equivalent of a stealth helicopter. It allowed the Vikings to strike anywhere, anytime. Imagine you are a monk living in a monastery in England or France. You are 200 miles inland. You think you are safe. You are surrounded by forests and fields. Then, one foggy morning, you hear the splash of oars. You look at the river, and you see dragon heads emerging from the mist. The Vikings, the psychological terror they inspired was off the charts. Christian Europe didn't understand what was happening. They thought it was the apocalypse. They prayed, from the fury of the Northmen, "O Lord, deliver us." The Vikings were terrifyingly efficient. They targeted monasteries first. Why? Not because they hated Christianity, they didn't care about your God, but because monasteries were basically banks. They were full of gold chalices, silver crosses, and fine wine, and they were guarded by monks who were ethically opposed to violence. It was like robbing a bank where the security guards are pacifists. The first major shock was the raid on Lindisfarne in 793. The Vikings stormed the Holy Island, butchered the monks, drowned them in the sea, and stripped the altars. It sent a shockwave through Europe. The safe places weren't safe anymore. But the Vikings weren't just pirates. They were explorers and colonizers. In the east, Swedish Vikings known as the Russ rowed their ships down the volatile rivers of Russia, trading slaves and fur, eventually founding the city of Kiev and giving their name to Russia itself. In the west, they settled in Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly touched the shores of North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. In France, they were a plague. They besieged Paris multiple times. The French kings, unable to defeat them militarily, tried to pay them to go away. This was called Dane Geld. Spoiler alert: if you pay a blackmailer, he doesn't go away. He comes back next year with his cousins. Finally, in 911, a French king got smart. He grabbed a Viking warlord named Rollo and made him an offer. "I'll give you a huge chunk of land on the coast. In exchange, you protect us from the other Vikings." Rollo accepted. He got baptized, though legend says he refused to kiss the king's foot and instead grabbed it and tipped the king over. The land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. These Vikings settled down. They learned French. They married local women. And within a few generations, they transformed from axe-minus wielding pagans into the Normans, the most disciplined, pious, and lethal heavy cavalry in Europe. They traded their long ships for war horses, but they kept their Viking aggression. So, the central government has collapsed again. Charlemagne's empire is fractured. The Vikings are ravaging the coasts. The Magyars, Hungarian horse archers, are raiding from the east. The Muslims are raiding from the south. If you are a regular person living in Europe in the year 900, you are terrified. The king is too far away to help you. The Roman legions are a distant memory. You need protection now. So, what do? You look up the hill. You see a local thug, a guy who has a big sword, a horse, and maybe a wooden fort. You go to him and you make a deal with the devil. You say, "I will give you my land. I will give you my labor. I will give you a share of my harvest every year. I will cook for you and clean for you." In exchange, when the Vikings come, you open the gates of your fort and let my family inside. This is the birth of feudalism. School textbooks make feudalism look like a neat little pyramid. King on top, nobles in the middle, peasants at the bottom. Everyone knows their place. It looks organized, but in reality, feudalism wasn't a system. It was a desperate survival strategy. It was a bunker mentality. It was a protection racket. The Lord was the mafia don. He provided protection, but the price was your freedom. The people who made this deal became serfs. Life for a serf was brutal. You were bound to the land. That's a polite way of saying you were a semi-minus slave. You weren't a chattel slave, you couldn't be sold away from your family, like in the American South, but you weren't free. You couldn't leave the village without the Lord's permission. You couldn't marry without paying a fee. If the Lord's daughter got married, you paid a tax. If the Lord was captured in war, you paid a tax to ransom him. You worked from sunrise to sunset, plowing fields with heavy wooden plows, praying that the harvest wouldn't fail, because if it did, you starved. The Lord didn't starve. He had the grain stores. You died. And let's talk about the guy in the castle. The knight. We have this romantic idea of chivalry. Knights in shining armor rescuing ladies, riding white horses, being polite. But let's be real, knights were professional killers. That was their job description. They were the tanks of the Middle Ages, encased in chainmail and later plate armor, riding massive war horses bred for aggression. They were virtually unstoppable against peasants. A knight could ride through a crowd of farmers like a bowling ball through pins. To stop these guys from just murdering everyone they wanted, the church invented chivalry. It was basically a PR campaign. The church tried to guilt Mina, strip the knights into behaving. A true knight protects the weak. A true knight serves God. A true knight doesn't loot churches. It didn't always work. Knights were still violent thugs a lot of the time, but at least it set a standard. It tried to civilize the warrior class. While the continent was locking itself into this feudal cage, something massive was brewing across the channel in England. England in the 11th century was a mess. It had been invaded by Vikings, then ruled by Anglo-Saxons, then Vikings again. It was a prize fighter that had taken too many punches. In 1066, the English king, Edward the Confessor, died, and he left no kids. This is the worst case scenario in a monarchy. A bar vacuum. Immediately, 3 guys stood up and said, "The chair is mine." First, Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England. The locals liked him. He was the home team candidate. Second, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a legendary Viking warrior who was basically 7 feet tall and had spent his life fighting as a mercenary in Constantinople. He claimed the throne based on an old deal. And third, William of Normandy, the Duke of Normandy. Remember the Normans? The Viking minus French hybrids? Yeah, this is their boss. He claimed Edward had promised him the throne years ago. This was a 3-weight age match for the crown. First, the Viking, Hardrada, landed in the north of England. Harold Godwinson marched his army all the way up and smashed the Vikings at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. It was a heroic victory. Hardrada was killed with an arrow to the throat. The Viking age in England ended right there, in the mud of Stamford Bridge. But Harold didn't have time to celebrate, because days later, news arrived: William has landed in the south. Poor Harold. He had to turn his exhausted, battered army around and march all the way to the bottom of England. They met at Hastings, October 14, 1066. This is the most famous battle in English history for a reason. It wasn't just a fight. It was a clash of styles. Harold's men fought on foot. They formed a shield wall, a solid mass of shields and axes on top of a hill. William's men were modern. They had archers. They had heavy cavalry. For hours, William couldn't break the wall. He charged up the hill, and the English axes, fearsome weapons that could chop a man and a horse in half, smashed his knights to pieces. William was losing. A rumor started spreading that William was dead. His army began to panic and retreat. So William did something brave. He took off his helmet. He rode in front of his troops, face exposed, shouting, "I am alive, and with God's help, I will conquer." Then, the Normans used a dirty trick. They pretended to run away. The English, thinking they had won, broke their shield wall to chase them down the hill. Fatal mistake. Once the English were scattered on the flat ground, the Norman knights turned their horses around. It was a slaughter. King Harold was killed, tradition says, by an arrow to the eye, though he was probably hacked to pieces by Norman knights. The English resistance collapsed. William marched to London. He was crowned on Christmas Day, 1066. He became William the Conqueror, and he changed everything. William didn't just want to be king, he wanted to own the place. He seized almost all the land in England and gave it to his French buddies. He replaced the English aristocracy with Normans. He replaced the English language with French. That's why English is such a weird language today. We have cow from the Germanic peasants and beef from the French masters. We have pig and pork, sheep and mutton. The conquest connected England to the politics and culture of the continent. It built the massive stone castles, like the Tower of London, that still stand today, symbols of Norman occupation meant to terrify the locals. Europe was now becoming organized. The chaos of the Dark Ages was fading. Kings were consolidating power. Borders were hardening. The Vikings had settled down. But as the kings grew stronger, they ran into a problem. There was another power in Europe, a power that didn't have an army, but had something even stronger: the keys to heaven. The Pope. For centuries, the Pope and the Emperor had been like an old married couple bickering, but staying together. But in the 11th century, they were about to file for a violent divorce. The fight was over who was the true boss of Christendom, and it would lead to one of the most dramatic showdowns in history: a king kneeling barefoot in the snow, begging a priest for mercy. So, William the Conqueror has locked down England. The Vikings have turned into Normans, and feudalism is the law of the land. Europe is getting organized, but as the kings of Europe grew stronger, they started to bump into a massive, invisible wall. You see, there were two superpowers in the Middle Ages. One was the state, the kings and emperors who held the sword. The other was the church, the Pope and the bishops who held the cross. For a long time, this was an uneasy partnership. The Pope needed the king's army for protection. The king needed the Pope's blessing for legitimacy. It was a marriage of convenience. But in the 11th century, the marriage fell apart. It turned into a mafia, a Minos-style turf war known as the investiture controversy. Now, investiture controversy is possibly the most boring name for the most exciting political drama in history. Let me break it down. The issue was simple: who gets to hire the staff? In the Middle Ages, a bishop wasn't just a guy in a funny hat who read the Bible on Sundays. A bishop was a prince. He controlled vast estates, thousands of serfs, and often commanded his own private army. He collected taxes. He was a major political player. Naturally, the king wanted to pick his own bishops. He wanted to give the job to his friends, his relatives, or the guy who paid him the most money. This was standard practice for centuries. The king would give the bishop his ring and staff. This was called investiture. But then, a new pope came along. Gregory VII. Gregory was not a politician. He was a monk. He was a hardliner. He looked at the church and saw corruption. He saw kings treating bishoprics like items on eBay. And he said, "No more." Gregory declared that the Pope and only the Pope had the power to appoint church officials. He went even further. He issued a document called the Dictatus Papae, which basically said the Pope is the master of the world. I can judge kings. I can fire emperors. And no one can judge me. The German Emperor, Henry IV, did not take this well. Henry was young, hot-headed, and powerful. He looked at this monk in Rome and thought, who does this guy think he is? Henry wrote a letter to the Pope, and it wasn't a polite, diplomatic note. It was savage. He addressed it to Hildebrand, not Pope but false monk. He accused the Pope of stepping on the heads of kings. He ended the letter with the Mic minus dropline I. Henry, King, by the grace of God, with all of my bishops, say to you descend, to be damned throughout the ages. Essentially go to hell. You fake Pope. If this were a physical fight, Henry would have won. He had an arm. The Pope had Swiss guards. But the Pope had a weapon that was stronger than any sword. A spiritual nuclear bomb. Excommunication. Gregory I excommunicated Henry IV. Now, to a modern mind, this might sound like getting kicked out of a country club. But in the 11th century, it was a catastrophe. It meant Henry was kicked out of the body of Christ. His soul was doomed to eternal hellfire. But the political consequences were even worse. The Pope declared that Henry's subjects were released from their oaths of loyalty. He told the German nobles, you don't have to obey this guy anymore. And the German nobles, who were always looking for an excuse to rebel, said, thanks, Pope, and immediately rose up against Henry. Henry watched his power evaporate overnight. His friends abandoned him. His enemies gathered armies. He realized he had lost. He had to beg for forgiveness. In the dead of winter, 1077, the most powerful man in the secular world crossed the Alps. He traveled to the fortress of Canossa in Italy, where the Pope was staying. This is one of the most famous scenes in history. Henry didn't march up to the door with his army. He walked. He took off his royal robes. He put on a rough hair minus shirt, the clothing of a penitent sinner, and he stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle gate for 3 days. Imagine the optics of that. The emperor, shivering in the cold, weeping, begging a priest to let him back in. Inside, the Pope was torn. As a politician, he wanted to crush Henry, but as a priest, he had to forgive a sinner who truly repented. Finally, on the 4th day, Gregory opened the door. He lifted the excommunication. Henry got his job back, but the damage was done. The image of the king kneeling before the Pope sent a shockwave through Europe. It proved that the Church was the ultimate superpower. This surge in religious confidence didn't just stay in Europe. It needed an outlet. The popes now felt they could command armies. And in 1095, Pope Urban I found the perfect target. He received a letter from the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. The Byzantines were Christians, but they were Greek Orthodox, not Catholic. They were being hammered by the Seljuk Turks, a new Islamic power that had taken over the Middle East. The emperor asked for a few hundred knights to help guard the border. Urban I didn't send a few hundred knights. He launched a global war. He called a council at Clermont in France. He stood in a field and delivered the most effective propaganda speech in history. He painted a lurid and largely exaggerated picture of Christian pilgrims being tortured in the Holy Land. He spoke of Jerusalem, the center of the world, being trampled by heathens. And then he made an offer that no one could refuse. He said, if you go to Jerusalem to fight the infidel, all your sins will be forgiven. Think about the medieval mind. These people were terrified of hell. They lived in a violent world where they sinned constantly. Knights killed people for a living. They were worried about their souls. And here was the Pope saying, you can do what you love killing, but do it for God, and you get a golden ticket to heaven. It was a spiritual loophole. The crowd went insane. They shouted Deus vult, God wills it. They tore up red cloth to make crosses and pinned them to their chests. But we have to be honest about the motivations here. History books often simplify the Crusades as just religious fanaticism. And for the poor peasants who marched, it probably was. But for the leadership, it was complicated. The knights, they wanted salvation. Yes, but they also wanted land. Europe was getting crowded. The laws of primogeniture meant that the eldest son got everything. The younger sons got nothing. The crusade was a chance for these younger sons to carve out new kingdoms in the east. The merchants, the Italians, Venice, Genoa, Pisa didn't care about the Holy Sepulchre. They cared about the trade routes. They wanted to break the Muslim monopoly on the spice trade. For them, this was a hostile corporate takeover. The First Crusade was a miracle of incompetence that somehow succeeded. An army of about 30, 0 to 40, 0 people including women, children, and elderly people marched 3,0 miles across Europe and Anatolia. They had no supply lines. They had no central command. They argued constantly. In the deserts of Anatolia, they nearly died of thirst. Chronicles describe knights drinking the blood of their horses and their own urine to survive. But they kept going. In 1099, they reached Jerusalem. The siege lasted 5 weeks. Finally, on July 15, they breached the walls. What followed was a massacre that still stains the relationship between East and West today. The Crusaders went berserk. They slaughtered the population of Jerusalem, Muslims and Jews alike. Men, women, children. The chroniclers bragged that our men rode in the blood of the Saracens up to the knees of their horses. They marched to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, singing hymns, with blood still wet on their boots. They established the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, etc. They built castles. They imported European feudalism to the Middle East, but they were always outnumbered. They were islands in a hostile sea. It was only a matter of time before the Islamic world reorganized and punched back. Over the next 2 centuries, 7 more major crusades were launched to defend these conquests. Most were disasters. The Second Crusade failed to take Damascus and went home embarrassed. The Third Crusade was a celebrity deathmatch between Richard the Lionheart of England and Saladin, the great Kurdish Sultan. They fought to a standstill. Richard realized he couldn't take Jerusalem, so he made a peace treaty and went home only to get kidnapped in Austria. But that's another story. The Fourth Crusade. Oh boy. This is the one that exposes the dark heart of the whole enterprise. It happened in 1204. The Crusaders wanted to go to Egypt. They hired the Venetians to build them a fleet, but they couldn't pay the bill. The Doge of Venice, a blind, 90-year-old shark named Enrico d'Andolo, said, "I have an idea. Why don't you help us attack a city called Zara?" Zara was a Christian city. The Pope was furious and excommunicated the whole crusade. But they didn't stop there. They got involved in a Byzantine civil war and ended up attacking Constantinople itself. The Crusaders, the soldiers of Christ, sacked the capital of the Christian East. They looted the Hagia Sophia. They melted down ancient Greek bronze statues to make coins. They burned the library. They destroyed the Byzantine Empire, the buffer state that protected Europe from the East. It was a crime of staggering stupidity and greed. It proved that the crusading movement had lost its soul. By 1291, the last Crusader city, Acre, Shell, the Muslims drove the Christians into the sea. The Crusades were over. Militarily, they were a failure. Jerusalem remained Muslim. But and this is a huge but, the Crusades changed Europe forever. When the knights came back, they were different. They had seen the world. They had seen the great cities of the East, which had street-lighted and paved roads and universities, while London was still a mud pit. They brought back tastes that would hook Europe like a drug: sugar, spices, lemons, silk, cotton. Europe woke up from its long slumber. It realized it was poor and backward. It wanted stuff. To get that stuff, you needed trade. The Italian cities Venice, Genoa, Florence became the middlemen. They became fabulously wealthy. And to handle all that money, they invented banking. They invented credit. They invented insurance. A new class of people emerged: the bourgeoisie, the city-minus dwellers, the merchants. In the old feudal system, you were either a fighter noble, a prayer priest, or a worker peasant. There was no place for a guy who bought and sold silk. But now, these merchants were richer than the dukes. They lived in cities that were becoming independent communes. They had a saying: "Stad loft matched fry city air makes you free." If a serf ran away from his lord's farm and managed to live in a city for a year and a day, he was a free man. The feudal lords hated this. They watched nervously as their labor force trickled away to the towns. The rigid hierarchy of the Middle Ages was beginning to crack. Money was eroding the power of land. And in the universities, yes, universities were popping up now. In Bologna, Paris, Oxford scholars were beginning to read the books brought back from the East. They were reading Aristotle again. They were asking questions. Europe was booming. The population had doubled. The climate was warm. The cathedrals were rising, turning stone into lace. It seemed like a new golden age was dawning. But nature has a cruel sense of humor. The 14th century was waiting around the corner, and it wasn't bringing sugar and spice. It was bringing the apocalypse. So by the year 1300, Europe was feeling pretty good about itself. The population was booming. The cathedrals were rising, and the merchants were getting rich. But history teaches us one thing: when things look too good to be true, the other shoe is about to drop. And in the 14th century, the shoe didn't just drop. It stomped on Europe's face. The apocalypse started with the weather. After centuries of a warm climate, the temperature suddenly plummeted. We call it the Little Ice Age. It rained for years. Literally. In 1315, it rained so much that the crops rotted in the mud. The Great Famine struck. Parents were forced to choose which child to feed and which one to let starve. There are horror stories from this time of cannibalism, of graves being robbed for food. It's often Europe up. It weakened the immune systems of an entire generation. They were waiting for a killer. And in 1347, the killer arrived. It came on a ship. In October of that year, a Genoese trading fleet docked in Messina, Sicily. They had come from the Black Sea. The dockworkers who boarded the ships recoiled in horror. The sailors were dead or dying. Their bodies were covered in blood, oozing boils the size of eggs in their armpits. On their necks, they were coughing up blood. The authorities ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but the rats had already scurried down the ropes. And on the rats were fleas, and inside the fleas was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, the Black Death. We have lived through endemics in our time, but the Black Death was an extinction event. It moved north with terrifying speed. It traveled along the very trade routes that had made Europe rich. It didn't care if you were a peasant or a prince. It killed the King of Castile. It killed the Archbishop of Canterbury. It killed the poor in their hovels and the rich in their palaces. Imagine the sensory reality of a plague city. The smell of rotting bodies was so thick, you could taste it. People walked around with masks filled with flowers and herbs, trying to block out the miasma, the bad air they thought caused the disease. The silence was deafening. Church bells stopped ringing because the bell-minus ringers were dead. Carts rattled over the cobblestones, the drivers calling out, "Bring out your dead." But soon, there were too many bodies for the carts. They were piled like firewood in the streets. The psychological trauma shattered the medieval mind. People believed God was punishing them. Some reacted with hedonism: "Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die." They partied in the graveyards. Others, the flagella NTS, marched from town to town whipping themselves with scourges until the blood ran, trying to atone for the sins of the world. In just 5 years, between 1347 and 1351, It is estimated that 30% to 50% of Europe's population died. That is 25 million people gone. But here is the dark irony of history. The plague was the best thing that ever happened to the common man. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated. Labor was cheap. A peasant was replaceable. If you didn't like your wages, the Lord could kick you out and hire the next guy. But after the plague, the survivors looked around and realized there is no one left to harvest the wheat. Suddenly, the peasant was a precious commodity. They had leverage. They demanded higher wages. They demanded better food. If a lord refused, they simply walked away to the next estate. The government tried to pass laws, the statute of laborers, to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. But it was useless. The market was stronger than the king. The chains of serfdom were snapped, not by a revolution, but by a supply and demand crisis. The feudal system, which relied on cheap, obedient labor, was broken forever. As the social order fractured, the political order descended into chaos. The two great powers of the West, England and France, decided this was the perfect time to start a war that would last for 100 years. The 100 Years' War 1337-1453 was a dynastic squabble that turned into a total war. The King of England, Edward III, claimed he was also the King of France. The French laughed at him, so Edward invaded. This war is important because it changed how we fight. At the beginning of the war, the French knights were the masters of the universe. They rode in gleaming plate armor, on massive war horses. They treated war like a sport. They expected to charge in, knock the English over, and capture them for ransom. But the English had a secret weapon, a weapon of mass destruction: the longbow. The English longbow was a 6-foot piece of yew wood. It had a draw weight of over 100 pounds. It took a lifetime to master. Archaeologists can identify English archers by their deformed skeletons because the muscle stress actually warped their bones. But a trained archer could loose 12 arrows a minute. And these arrows, the bodkin points, could punch through plate armor like it was tin foil. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, and later at Agincourt in 1415, the French knights charged. They were met by a storm of steel. The English arrows darkened the sky. The French chivalry was slaughtered in the mud. They were cut down by common peasants who they despised. It was a democratization of violence. The age of the invincible knight was over. If a peasant with a stick could kill a duke in armor, the whole social hierarchy was a lie. By 1429, France was on its knees. The English controlled Paris. The French crown prince, the Dauphin Charles, was a weak, indecisive man hiding in the south. The French army was demoralized. It seemed that France would cease to exist as an independent nation. Then, the impossible happened. A miracle walked through the door. A teenage girl from a remote village on the border of Lorraine arrived at the court. Her name was Joan. She was illiterate. She was a peasant, but she claimed that voices Street, Michael, Street, Catherine were speaking to her. They told her that she was chosen by God to drive the English out of France. In any other era, she would have been dismissed as a lunatic or burned as a witch immediately. But Charles was desperate. He had nothing left to lose. He had her examined by theologians. They found nothing wrong. So, he did the unthinkable. He gave a 17-year-old girl a suit of white armor, a banner, and command of an army. Joan of Arc was not just a mascot. She was a force of nature. She rode to the besieged city of Orleans. The French generals wanted to be cautious. Joan said, "No, we attack." She led the charge herself. She was wounded by an arrow in the shoulder, pulled it out, and kept fighting. The soldiers, seeing this teenage girl fearlessly charging into the English cannons, believed they were witnessing a living saint. Their morale skyrocketed. They fought with the fury of the possessed. Orleans was saved. Zheng led the Dauphin to Reims, deep in enemy territory, to be crowned King Charles VII. She accomplished in a few months what French generals had failed to do for decades. But her story has a tragic ending. She was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English, and sold to the English army. The English were terrified of her. They couldn't admit she was sent by God, because that would mean God was against them. So they had to prove she was a witch. They put her on trial in Rouen. It was a sham, a political hijab. Zheng, an uneducated girl, outsmarted the judges for weeks. But the verdict was rigged. On May 30, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She asked for a cross to be held before her eyes as the flames rose. She screamed Jesus one last time before she died. She was 19 years old. The English executioner later said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." He was right. Killing her didn't stop the French. It enraged them. Zheng became a martyr. The French united. They reformed their army. They adopted a new technology that was coming from the East: gunpowder artillery. At the Battle of Castillon in 1453, the French didn't charge the English archers. They blew them up with cannons. The English were driven into the sea. The 100 Years' War was over. The year 1453 is often cited as the end of the Middle Ages. In the West, the war ended. But in the East, a tragedy occurred that would reshape the world. Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the city that had stood for 1,000 years, finally fell. The Ottoman Turks, led by the young Sultan Mehmed II, breached the massive Theodosian walls using giant cannons. The last Roman emperor died fighting on the walls. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. But endings are also beginnings. As the Turks advanced, Greek scholars fled Constantinople. They packed up their libraries' ancient manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Homer, and fled to Italy. They arrived in Florence, Venice, and Rome. They met Italian scholars who were hungry for this ancient wisdom. This collision of Greek knowledge and Italian money sparked a fire. At the same time, in Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was tinkering with a wine press. He realized that if he made little metal letters that could be moved around, he could print pages faster than any monk could write. In 1455, he printed his Bible. The information age had begun. Ideas could now spread faster than the church could control them. Knowledge was no longer locked in monasteries. It was in the hands of the people. The feudal system was broken by the plague. The knights were made obsolete by gunpowder. The old map of the world was being redrawn. Europe was waking up. The heavy, Gothic fog of the Middle Ages was lifting. The survivors of the plague, the wars, and the famines looked at the world with new eyes. They no longer looked only to heaven for answers. They began to look at man. They looked at science, at art, at exploration. The Dark Ages weren't ever really dark. They were a crucible in the fires of 1,000 years of struggle. The modern world was forged. The nations we know today, France, England, Spain, were born in this era. The universities we attend, the banks we use, the parliaments we vote in all have their roots in the medieval soil. The story of the Middle Ages is the story of us. It is the story of how humanity, when faced with the collapse of civilization, found the strength to pick up the pieces and build something new. From the ruins of Rome to the spires of the Renaissance, it was a long, bloody, and magnificent journey. And as the sun rose on the modern era, the ghosts of knights, monks, and serfs faded into history, leaving behind a world forever changed.